Visibility 8 kilometers.
Ready?
Just coming over the river. Great.
That video that you just saw was a clip of Bob Moriarty, American Marine F-4B fighter pilot in 1984 at age 37, making headlines for flying between the pillars of the Eiffel Tower aboard a Beechcraft Bonanza aircraft. Bob holds the record as the youngest naval aviator at age 20 in the U.S. Vietnam War, achieving the rank of captain in the Marines, age 22. Before leaving military service in 1970, he recorded 824 combat missions. He holds 14 international aviation records, including record flight time between New York to Paris in 2 different categories. He was part of a team entered in the Paris to Libreville, Gabon air race, but an engine failure south of Portugal forced him to drop out. But after repairing the plane and encouraged by Richard Fenwick, he turned his attention to the Eiffel Tower. Bob, welcome.
It's a pleasure to meet you and to talk with you.
Hey, thank you, Bob. Likewise, the pleasure is all mine. So I have some very exciting questions and interesting topics to talk with you about today, and some articles and things that we chatted about before the interview. But before we get into those, I just want to very quickly ask: flying underneath the Eiffel Tower, those pillars, when you decided to do that, were you at all concerned with the getting into big trouble, or was it just so exciting that you thought, I can't pass up the opportunity?
Well, strange enough, things have changed a lot in 40 years. And it was almost exactly 40 years ago. And you could do things like that back then, and you can't do them now. Richard Fenwick was the head of the French Aero Club, and it was something that the French are not as concerned with what you do as much as how you do it. And I would encourage anyone whoever visits Paris to look at the Eiffel Tower. And strange enough, from a technical point of view, there was nothing to it. I was landing on aircraft carriers when I was 19 years old. So flying under the Eiffel Tower was a piece of cake.
Exciting to be talking to you. You have a military background, but you also have a unique area of study in commodities, natural resources, and of course, precious metals. I want to jump right into it. We discussed this Russia Today article before the interview. The headline of the article is "New War is Coming." I'll just read a quote from it quickly, which is, "The world is on the brink of catastrophe," UN Security General Antonio Guterres said on Friday. "One rash move, one miscalculation could trigger a catastrophe that goes far beyond the border and frankly beyond imagination." Speaking in reference to Lebanon, Israel potential conflict there, or widening of conflict there. He said the world cannot afford Lebanon to become another Gaza. And earlier this week, Foreign Minister Israel Katz warned that the Jewish state was very close to a decision that could change the rules of the game against the Shia militia. You noted to me that this is particularly important, this article. Can you please tell me your thoughts there?
Well, here's the deal. I've been saying for the last month that we're very close to a nuclear war, but who am I? Okay, really? And even though I have some credibility because of my military background, this is the Secretary General of the UN. And he's saying we're on the verge of a catastrophe. Now, did you happen to see or hear what the president of Serbia said a week ago? He said we are going to be in a world war in 3 to 4 months, if not sooner. And since then, things have gotten easily 10 times or 100 times worse. Now, right now, we are in 4.5 wars. We've got the Hezbollah, we've got the Hutus, and they have sunk 2 ships in the last week, and they are strangling the economy of Israel. Now, the mainstream media lies about everything. Okay, so you're not hearing this in the mainstream media, but Israel's economy is on the verge of collapse. Okay, if they attack Hezbollah, and there have been minor skirmishes on both sides, Israel has told the United States they may use weapons they've never used before, which of course is referring to the nuclear weapons that Israel has that they've always denied. Now, Hezbollah has somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 missiles, cruise missiles, and rockets. And I've seen reports saying since they defeated Israel in 2006, they now have up to 1 million weapons they could fire at Israel. If they do that, they could totally destroy Israel. Israel attacking Hezbollah is easily one of the stupidest things I've ever seen. But you've got a problem with Israel. These people are taught they're the chosen people, that their lives, their fingernails are worth the lives of 1,000 non-Jews. And quite bluntly, they're led by insane people. Now, here's a scenario that is possible. Israel attacks Hezbollah. Hezbollah responds and fires 50 or 100,000 rockets or missiles all over Israel and brings Israel to a halt. Israel nukes Damascus. And Iran comes in, and nobody knows this again because the mainstream media is lying about everything. Now, in my books and in my website, when I do interviews, I try to communicate to people that ordinary people with ordinary intelligence and ordinary knowledge can come to valid solutions if they ask themselves the right question. And what happened was Israel attacked Iran's embassy in Damascus. That pissed Iran off. So Iran wanted to teach Israel a lesson. So they launched hundreds of cruise missiles, drones, and rockets at Israel. But the real key, and nobody in the media wants to point this out, there were 3 targets. There was the spook station in the Golan Heights that controlled the battle. There was the 2 Air Force bases that the airplanes launched from to hit the embassy. So there were 3 targets. How many 3 targets did Iran hit?
From memory, Bob, I believe it was all of them.
Thank you. You have it exactly right. Now, I was a forward air controller in Vietnam, and quite bluntly, hitting targets is very difficult. It's a lot easier now because the weapon systems are far better. But when you have 100% accuracy, you won. Now, Israel came back and threw some rocks at Iran. But the fact is, the whole balance of power in the Middle East shifted from Israel, which everybody believed held the balance of power, to Iran. Nobody knew Iran was so good. But from a mathematical point of view, Iran spent somewhere between $50 and $100 million to hit the 3 targets, and they did hit those 3 targets. The Allied forces, and this includes France, the UK, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United States, and Israel, spent somewhere between $3.5 and $5 billion. From a mathematical point of view, when you put a $20 million tank into combat and somebody destroys it with a $5,000 drone, you lost, okay? And that's what people don't realize, because you got to pay for these wars. It was an overwhelming victory for Iran. Now let's fast forward to Gaza. Do you remember what Israel's prime directive and their prime policy was? What did they want to do in Gaza?
From loose memory, Bob, did it have something to do with recovering hostages?
That was the secondary. The primary was to destroy Hamas. Have they destroyed Hamas?
The answer is to that question, I think, is no.
Absolutely. They lost, okay? Netanyahu came out and said, we're going to destroy Hamas. But when you attack 2.2 million men, women, and children, okay, and you slaughter tens of thousands of them, and you murder babies, and you shoot old ladies carrying white flags, and you kill people who are waiting for refugee supplies, you lost, okay? So the real battle in Gaza is an effort on part of Netanyahu to stay out of jail. And the Israeli military has woken up to that fact, but they're still extremely arrogant. They believe they can take on Hezbollah. And should Israel attack Hezbollah, very bad things are going to happen, and it could easily go nuclear. And if Israel drops the first nuke, it could bring in Russia, it could bring in China, it could bring in Iran, it could bring in Syria, it could bring in Pakistan, it could bring in Turkey. So the good news is that perhaps we won't have a nuclear war and Israel will wake up. And the bad news is maybe Israel will not wake up. But in either case, we're going to have peace in the Middle East for the first time in 80 years. And that's important.
Bob, what is your opinion about cause for these concurrent wars that are occurring at the moment?
Well, the scary thing is that every one of it's different. What was it the Yemen rebels said? What did they want? They had a purpose. They had a goal. They said, this is what we want. What was it?
I believe that their demands were to, and have been, to an end to the hostilities.
Thank you. Okay,
yeah.
You're again absolutely correct. They wanted a ceasefire, which frankly I think is a very valuable, important thing to ask for. So what did Hezbollah demand? I
didn't look too closely on it, but did they ask for the same thing?
Thank you. Bingo. You're getting 100%. What Hezbollah wanted and what the Yemen rebels wanted was exactly the same. Okay, they wanted a ceasefire. Now, anyone can look at what's going on in Gaza, and that is genocide. It is a war crime. The International Criminal Court, highest court in the world, recognized it as genocide. The United States and Israel are still pretending it's not genocide, but of course it's genocide. It could not possibly be more evil and more cruel. Now, on the day after the attack on October 7th, one of the leading newspapers in Israel, Haaretz, came out and said 100% of the responsibility for the attack on October 7th is on the shoulders of the leadership of Israel because of the way they have treated the Arabs. And they're absolutely correct. Now, if you and I criticize Israel, we're called anti-Semites. But the strange thing is the Israeli newspapers can be fiercely critical and absolutely accurate. We need peace in the Middle East, and the United States and Israel are on 100% war economies, and that's extremely dangerous for the world. Now, you ask a question, a general question, what's behind all these? In simple terms, Ukraine is behind the military-industrial complex. The neocons set up that war. Ukraine and NATO and the United States started it, and Russia was forced to respond. Now, let me read something to you. I made a comment about the mainstream media. and I'm going to prove this is true. Are you aware of who Nigel Farage is in the UK?
I don't follow his work too closely, but I'm aware of who he is, yes.
A very interesting guy. When the UK was in the European Union, okay, he was fiercely critical, and he was behind Brexit and had a lot to do with it. And his statements and its videos are absolutely amazing, because you got a politician who calls a spade a spade. Now, this was in CNN a couple days ago. UK's Nigel Farage sparks outrage from opponents after saying West provoked Ukraine war. Well, here's the problem. The West did provoke the war. The United States has been attacking the Soviet Union since 1945. All of the Ukrainian Nazis who were guilty of the worst war crimes in World War II were literally shipped to the United States and Canada and given citizenship. There wasn't a single Ukrainian Nazi who was put up on war crimes trials, and they should have been put up for war crimes trials. So there was a low-level conflict literally going back 80 years. And then in 2014, and you can go to YouTube and you can put in Victoria Nuland and $5 billion, and you could see Victoria Nuland bragging about the United States spending $5 billion to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ukraine. Now, she talks about it bringing democracy to Ukraine. But the interesting thing is, how do you bring democracy to a country? By destroying their democracy. And the answer is you can't. But Victoria Nuland absolutely should be up on war crimes trials. And the blood of 1 million Ukrainian soldiers is on her hands. And very few people realize this because the mainstream media won't point it out. But Ukraine was prepared to invade Donbass on March 10th. And Putin preempted that attack by attacking them. In 2019, the RAND Corporation was paid by the Department of Defense to come up with a paper to say, this is how you can get Russia to attack the Ukraine. And it was quite simple. All they had to do is try to bring Ukraine, which is the most corrupt country in Europe, into NATO. Now, 30 years ago, when the USSR collapsed after the reunification of Germany, the Russians and the Americans and the Germans agreed that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And that was 17 countries ago. So the whole thing about bringing Ukraine into NATO was strictly a guise to get Russia to attack Ukraine. And the belief was, the United States believed that all the sanctions would hurt Russia economically, and exactly the opposite is true. What has happened is the BRICS and the unaligned nations of the world have looked at the United States and they've said, this is wrong. We don't want to participate in that. And you've got a very few leaders in Europe, mainly Hungary, okay, who are saying, we're not going to play these stupid games. But the real important question, this is the question that nobody's asking, what did Russia do that was a threat to the EU? And the answer is nothing. So, in fact, the West did provoke the Ukraine war. Boris Johnson bears a lot of the responsibility for the deaths of 1 million Ukrainian soldiers, because Ukraine and Russia had actually, they hadn't signed, but they had initialed a peace agreement in March of 2022. Russia wanted the United States to do what they said 30 years ago, and the United States lied. And Russia wanted Ukraine to do what they signed as the Minsk II agreement. And both the UK and Germany have admitted since then that Ukraine never had an intention of honoring the Minsk II agreements. And in fact, the pause was designed just to give Ukraine a chance to rearm. And strange enough, and this is obvious, do you ever remember reading anything about the 100-Year War? And that's going back 5 or 6 centuries. Do you remember at least being aware of it?
No, I certainly did not encounter that.
The strange thing is, one European country against another European country, and it was a war that went on for 100 years. Now, when I say a war goes on for 100 years, what should immediately occur to you? What is the most obvious thing? What's unique about a 100-year war?
Well,
damn, 100 years? You guys were fighting a war for 100 years? That's a long time to be fighting a war. Now, I remember taking European history in high school and reading about the 100-Year War, and I thought, nobody would be that stupid today. But in fact, the United States went to war against Afghanistan, and they were fighting goat herders, and it went on for 20 years. Now, one of the newspapers that was behind the war initially did a big report about 15 years into the war, and they did a lot of interviews with people who are in the military and people who are in the State Department, and they came out and said, you know, this is really stupid. We've been lied to right from the very beginning. We were never winning this war. There's no way to win this war, and we should really pull out. And of course, it took the United States government another 5 years to actually do that. And this whole time, I'm thinking, why did we attack Afghanistan? What exactly did Afghanistan do to justify that? But the United States and now NATO and the EU have made this giant mistake of believing their own bullshit. And it has cost the EU and it's cost the United States, and the cost could go through the stratosphere shortly. The war in Ukraine is stupid. It's pointless. It is not our war. We have lost the war from the very beginning. And what happened this last weekend in Crimea?
Well, there was the missile attack, which killed civilians that were at the beach, families.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, and it can be a little confusing because the media is always wrong in one way or another on both sides. It was not a deliberate attack on the beach. It was a deliberate attack on Sevastopol, and they were probably aiming at ships there because it's a big military port. But the missiles were controlled by a Global Hawk U.S. drone, okay? And I'll be candid. That attack really pissed off Russia, and Russia has said, we're going to make you guys pay. The United States and NATO keep pushing Putin. And when someone has as many effective weapons as Putin does, and frankly, holds the moral high ground, you shouldn't screw with it. We stand to gain nothing in that war. It was a stupid war before it started. It was a stupid war when it started, and it's a stupid war now. And it could cost the United States their entire country. We stand to win nothing, but we stand to lose a lot. Now, since you're doing so good on all my trick questions, how many nuclear weapons would it take to destroy the United States?
I cheated on this one because I saw you ask this question to somebody else. And I don't know too much about how it works, but from what I recall you saying, one right in the middle detonated at a high altitude, which would cause a electromagnetic blast that would destroy electronic networks. Is that right?
Correct. It would fry every computer chip in the United States, part of Mexico, and part of Canada. The idea that we're not vulnerable is stupid. And all these armchair generals who get on television who talk about how we're winning, we're not winning. There's nothing to win. Okay. When it would take one EMP weapon to destroy the United States, you should mind your manners. Now, I grew up in Texas, and there was a saying in Texas that an armed society is a polite society. Now, believe it or not, the people who have been reasonable, who have used logics and facts and history, are Lavrov and Putin. Okay, they've said, hey, we want secure borders. That's all we're asking for. And we're tired of these Nazis in Ukraine killing 14,000 people in Donbass. And if you guys won't stop doing it, we'll put a stop to it. And that's all they were asking for. And quite bluntly, that's reasonable. Now, when you say, what does the United States stand to gain? Nothing. Okay. Did you happen to catch what the president of Poland said at the peace conference? Or, no, that was actually the meeting of the G7. They got the meeting of the G7 and the president of Poland's there. What did he say?
Yeah, I saw that comment. It was something along the lines of Russia being a prison of 200 nations or 200 nationality ethnic groups, that, implying a breakup of the country along ethnic lines.
Yeah, we should break the country into 200 pieces. Now then, when a guy could take the most powerful country in the world out with one EMP weapon, that's a really stupid thing to say. Now, there are other weapons that people haven't even talked about. The United States has spent billions of dollars trying to develop hypersonic missiles and failed every single time. The Iranians have hypersonic missiles. The Chinese are working on the hypersonic missiles. The Russians have hypersonic missiles. Why would you screw with the guy who's a gun when all you've got is a penknife? And that's the situation we're in now. And quite bluntly, and this all goes back to your original question, what causes all these wars and various different things. Hamas was the legal, democratically elected government of Gaza. And Gaza was the world's largest open-air prison camp. And they wanted freedom. They wanted their homeland back. And that's actually quite reasonable. Now, I don't support terrorism, but the terrorism in the Middle East isn't from Hamas. It's from Israel. It's always been from Israel. Okay. When 1,200 people were killed on October 7th, 450 of them were police and members of the IDF, and those are absolutely legitimate legal targets. And of the 750 civilians who were killed, most of them were killed by the IDF. The babies that were beheaded, Israel lied. Okay, the baby that was cooked in the microwave, Israel lied. There was a general standing in front of a building where a whole family had been massacred, and he said Hamas killed these people. But you could see clearly that a tank had fired at the building, and the people inside the building, the innocent civilians, were killed by the IDF. So we get lied to so much. You have to use logic and you have to use facts. Okay. And all these people commenting about Israel, all these people commenting about Yemen, all these people commenting about Ukraine have opinions, but they're not based on educated facts. Okay. I was in a war. I hate war. I've written about it. In a war, like Vietnam. And I think there were 3.5 million Americans who served total. There's only about 10 or 15% of the people who are actually in combat. The grunts are in combat. The helicopter pilots are in combat. The bird dog pilots are in combat. Everybody else pretty much is attending the war, but they're not fighting the war. And I fought a war, and I'm dead set against war, and I'm dead set against what we're doing. And I can assure your listeners it's going to end badly for both Israel and the United States.
Well, then, Bob, who benefits from war?
The military-industrial complex. We've got a society that it's run by the oligarchs. I mean, the idea that voting in the United States affects things, that's the biggest joke in the world. I think I've seen numbers saying 65% of Americans are against the slaughter in Gaza, and the people who are doing the reporting are the mainstream media, and they're biased anyway, okay? So if they say 65%, you know it's much higher than that. But Eisenhower warned us against the military-industrial complex. MacArthur warned us against the military-industrial complex, and they knew. And the military-industrial complex now runs the United States. Now, you mentioned I was an F-4B pilot. In the mid-'60s, up until I got out in 1970, the F-4 was the hottest fighter in the world, and I was flying those when I was 20 years old. I had about 125 missions in combat, so I'm certainly qualified to talk about fighters. We have spent over $2 trillion on the F-35, and I will tell you that's the biggest piece of crap airplane ever built. They can only get 30% of them airborne at any time. And if it actually went into combat against the Iranians or against the Russians or against the Chinese, they would be slaughtered. Every war changes the weapons of war. The submarine and the use of balloons for observation and the machine gun all came from the Civil War. World War I, we had airplanes come into their own, okay, and we had tanks. And World War II led to the demise of the battleships and brought carriers out in force. Vietnam, we used helicopter envelopment. But what the Russians have showed in Ukraine is that tanks are nothing but targets. The aircraft carriers are absolutely meaningless now. They're nothing but big floating targets. And airplanes like the F-35, the F-35 doesn't have the range that an F-4 had when I was flying them 55 years ago. So we have not moved forward. We've spent a lot of taxpayer money. If the debt in the United States, the funded debt is 35 trillion, over 2 trillion of that is for one airplane that is not a good combat airplane. So that's basically the status of the conflicts. Now, would you like to know how bad a shape we're in economically?
Sure.
Okay. There is an AI company that as of a week ago was the most valuable company in the world. How much value has that company lost in 4 days?
I saw a quotation on this, something like 500 billion in market cap.
580 billion. Okay. And nobody's talking about this yet, but it's really funny. 580 billion happens to be a big number. Okay. So the stock market has one foot on a banana peel and the other foot in the grave, and Navita could drag the whole thing down with it. Real people with real money invested in a stock that hit its high on Thursday, and $580 billion has disappeared since then. So they thought they had real money 4 days ago, and it went to money heaven since then.
Bob, the weapons of war have changed, as you explained, and a lot of people are talking now about the aircraft carrier being an outdated form of weapon. What do you think that implies for the U.S. dollar globally? Because I've read other people's work, and one book in particular called Super Imperialism by Michael Hudson. And I know that you don't need me to tell you this, and our viewers don't either, but he talks in this book about how a lot of other countries may have been pressured or coerced in various ways to fill their foreign exchange reserves with U.S. dollar holdings. So if the capacity of coercion goes away or is significantly diminished, what do you think that implies for the U.S. dollar longer term?
The U.S. dollar will trade long term, but it will trade in the same way the British pound trades. Okay. My wife was British. Okay. She was born in 1944. So she remembers rationing, and the Brits were on rationing until 1954. So when a country loses its reserve currency, bad things happen. So the dollar will trade. The dollar's not going to disappear. But depending on how stupid the government is, and quite bluntly, the government's been pretty stupid lately. Part of the G7 and the peace conference was an agreement to steal part of the $300 billion that the United States and EU seized from Russia. And that's an idea. When your next door neighbor comes over and talks to you, and he's mad at the bank because they just stole his bank account, and you realize you're banking at the same bank, you look at it and say, damn, I need to move my account. And what's happening right now, and this is a direct cause of the United States and so in the EU stealing from Russia, and it is stealing. A Japanese bank last week said they were going to sell $63 billion in government bonds. Now, it's not all U.S. government bonds. There's a lot of European bonds too. But they've had such big losses because of the interest rates and going up that they're in trouble, and to stay alive, they got to dump $63 billion between now and next March. And of course, that's going to cause a cascading decline. And Japan has been the biggest holder of U.S. treasuries. China's dumping them with both hands. Russia dumped all theirs. So the cost of inflation is going to go much higher in the United States. And we've got something like 360 banks in the United States that have paper losses that could easily turn into very real losses. So the long answer is the dollar will be around, and the short answer and more correct answer is, but it's going to be a lot lower value. We could easily turn into a second or third world country. It happened to Spain, it happened to the UK, it happened to France, and it could easily happen to the United States. If anybody believes that we're governed by the best of the brightest right now, I can assure them we are not.
I have a very strange question to ask you, frankly, and that is that if we looked at the world from a Malthusian perspective, would a significant reduction of civilian life in general, do you think that there are groups that would consider that to be beneficial or framed from a cynical viewpoint, good for the planet?
Sure, absolutely. Are you familiar with the Deagle report?
I saw that one, yeah.
Okay, Deagle came out, I think, 2014 or 2015. And they showed the population then, and then they showed the projected population of 2025. And some countries like the United States, the population was down 70%. Now, certainly the World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, these guys all agree on one thing, and that is we have too many people. But this goes back, and if you read Michael Hudson, the guy is absolutely brilliant, and he's written several books about banking system over history, and he's probably the only guy in the United States, maybe in the world, who actually understands it. But there's always a conflict between the debtors and the creditors. And the way Roman history and Greek history has gone, the creditors end up with all of the money and all of the power. We have the richest people in world history in comparison to any other time in history. You can look at it with the NVDA. You know, how can you have a country? How can you have a company with 24 billion shares and a market value of $3.5 trillion? That's just amazing. But Apple, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, all of these people have amassed so much money, and they think that because they've got dollars that they have sense. And that's not true at all. I grew up in Texas, and we had a lot of kids whose parents were rich from the East Texas oil fields, and they all thought they were superior to the rest of us who had parents that worked for a living. And the fact of the matter is, much wealth is an accident of timing more than anything else. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs just happened to get it to computing at exactly the right time where major changes were taking place. And both of them learned how to use computers, and both of them were visionaries of sorts. And of course, that's totally changed the world. This whole AI thing, it's totally overblown. It isn't anywhere nearly as important or as valuable as people have said. And it's a giant consumer of energy. And quite bluntly, it doesn't work very well. I was reading an article today that AI has learned to lie. And I thought, how wonderful. I can go to work tomorrow for the mainstream media. So the world is changing, and not necessarily in a good way. And it's a conflict between the people with the debt and the people who are the creditors. In biblical times, starting in Babylonia, the smart kings would write off the debt and start all over again. Now, the world is awash in debt now, and the banks want to get paid. Have you read or have you interviewed anybody on the Great Taking?
Oh, yeah, I've read The Great Taking. Fascinating. I haven't interviewed the author, Mr. Webb, but just frightening, frankly, that book.
Actually, not. I make the comment as often as I can that if you ask the right question, you have a chance of getting the right answer. Now, pretend for a minute that the S&P and the Dow and everything crashes and the dollar drops 30% of its value and the banks close. What is the chance of the Great Taking actually taking place in a country with 400 million guns?
That's a really good point.
The strange thing is, I've had people ask me, I said, look, there isn't a chance in hell. I'll give the author credit. He has done a brilliant job, and everything that he says is valid, and he's done research into it, and it's factual, but it ain't going to happen.
That's great to hear. I want to ask you now about commodity supplies and commodity supply chains during war times. Based on your experience, observation, and study, what, in your opinion, tends to happen during times of war to the commodity supplies and the commodity supply chains? And what are tactics that defending and attacking sides might do in relation to their commodity supply and the supply chain management?
Well, and everybody that I see is talking about the last war. The United States just passed a bill for a draft, including women. Germany has talked about drafting. Poland has talked about drafting. And the really interesting thing is that's what we used to do. But I have seen reports that said World War III, it's going to last for 72 minutes. Minutes, not hours, not days, not 10 years. I mean, the United States is talking about funding Ukraine for another 10 years. And that's really funny because if you think Biden's senile now, can you imagine how senile he's going to be 10 years from now? So I don't think, I mean, Russia has a torpedo that can sit on the seafloor and they can launch remotely that could take out the East Coast. I mean, I just don't see a long conflict that's going to affect the supply chains at all. And some stuff, I mean, the really funny thing is, if you really believe we're going to war, you know, how much concern do you have of your investments? And my answer is none. Okay, the only thing I'm really worried about investing in right now is food and water for a year. And this is absolutely the time to be prepared. But either, you know, we're going to make it through the next 6 months or we're not going to make it through the next 6 months. I'm doing my part to say we got a real problem and we need to be talking about it. I would hope that the powers that be in Russia and China are on the phone right now to Netanyahu saying, you know, Bibi, we got an idea. And the idea is if you keep being stupid, we're going to turn Israel into a sheet of glass 16 meters thick. Why don't you stop being stupid? Okay. If you go back to the Balfour document, they made it clear that the rights of the indigenous living in Palestine were not to be abused. Everything the UN has ever done has said two-state country. The United States has always said they support a two-state nation. And Bibi wants to stay out of jail, and he's willing to threaten World War III. And I would hope that somebody bigger and meaner than Bibi would take him aside and have a long talk with him.
Do you feel that in terms of potential escalation, it would either go one of two ways, one being all the way into a 72-minute conclusion, or what would be the other? A likelihood of de-escalation? Because as you pointed out, various European countries have been putting into place drafting legislation. And the U.S. just passed legislation recently. I think maybe you just mentioned it about the automatic selective service registration. Sweden, Finland, recent additions to NATO. So are these signs of just a much larger military mobilization?
No, those people are fighting last year's war. We're not going to have that kind of war. We know that's true. Okay. You have interviewed Jim Rickards, haven't you?
In the past, yes. Okay.
Did you ever ask him about participating in war games between the U.S. and Russia?
The conversations that he and I had about it were isolated to mainly gold.
Oh, okay. You should have talked to him. Jim Rickards is really an interesting person. He's written a lot of books. He was legal counsel to long-term capital management. He lost all his fortune with long-term capital management, but he has been on the periphery of the military-industrial complex. And Jim Rickards has participated in several war games between the United States and Russia, and in 100% of them, it went nuclear. I can tell you based on my experience that my opinion, and that's opinion in quotation marks. I can't say it factually, but I could say it. My opinion is it could easily go nuclear, but Jim Rickards has participated with the game players and with the decision makers, and in every single case, it went nuclear. So why NATO and Finland and Sweden and Denmark and Poland are pushing Russia is totally insane. None of these people has bothered to ask, why is Russia the enemy? And the only reason it's the enemy is because they're lapdogs for the United States, and they think they need to suck up to the United States. But if you think you need to suck up to the United States, you ought to look at the idiots running the country. Okay? They couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag. We got our ass kicked in Vietnam. We got our ass kicked in Iraq. We got our ass kicked in Afghanistan. The Hutus, who are wearing turbans and sandals, just kicked the shit out of Israel. Okay, so clearly the guys at the top are making flawed decisions based on bad logic and lack of facts. Now, there is no rule that says you have to like your neighbor. It doesn't exist. However, there is a law that says you got to get along with your neighbor. Okay. Now, Russia is the largest country in the world. It is a relatively peaceful country. It has good leadership. They're fighting for peace. They're not fighting for more war. They're not fighting for the military-industrial complex. And quite bluntly, their weapons are so much superior to everything that I ever saw. They replaced me. When I was flying the Bird Dog, we lost more Bird Dogs per flight hour in Vietnam than any other aircraft there. Now, nobody thinks much of the Bird Dogs. They're little single-engine Cessnas. However, we were the cutting edge of the sword. We lost more pilots in Bird Dogs than in any other aircraft in the war. We lost about 10,000 airplanes in total. My job has been replaced with a $1,000 drone. I can't tell you how offended I am at that. I used to go out and get shot at 2 or 3 times a day, and they replaced me with a $1,000 kid's drone.
Bob, in the U.S., I noticed that there are segments now, what I would call the political class, that have been promoting a concept of civil war and decline of empire. In the past, I've only seen that more so discussed by sort of fringe alternative commentary sources. And it's being conveyed now through films such as the recent film called Civil War. And it's being talked about by noted figures such as Ray Dalio and Niall Ferguson. Why do you think, if you notice this as well, why do you think these concepts are actively being promoted now or sold to the general public? And do you think that these concepts could be used as a scapegoat of sorts, similar to the Thucydides trap argument, where these outcomes are destined to occur and there's nothing that we can do to stop them? What are your thoughts there?
Well, it's interesting that Obama is part of the movie, okay? And behind that, if you ask me, do I think there's a chance of a civil war in the United States? I'd say absolutely. The use of the law in New York City to screw Trump was absolutely remarkable. And Como did an interview in the last couple of days, and he said that those charges should have never been brought. They were total fraud. And if you look at the case in Georgia, the same thing is true. The Supreme Court is going to come out with 5 very important decisions between today and I think Wednesday. And one of them being, did they use the law correctly when they were enhancing the sentences of the January 6th people? And quite bluntly, I think that whole January 6th thing was criminal in nature. They lied, they covered up, they instigated the thing, and it was all designed to get Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump is coming up for sentencing just before the Republican convention. And one of the very real alternatives is that corrupt judge in New York could throw him in jail. I think, quite bluntly, we're very close to a civil war. You could see that crime is totally out of control in the Democrat-run cities. And should the stock market crash or should the banks crash, that would be fuel to the fire. So I see a lot of potentially bad things in the next 6 months. This election is going to be a Chinese fire drill. I don't believe for a minute that Biden will actually be the Democrat candidate, but Biden and Trump are not the best and the brightest, not the greatest candidates the United States have ever had. Could there be an organization, a group behind trying to prepare the United States for a civil war? Yeah, absolutely. I believe so.
Bob, with the prospect of these wars that we've talked about so far potentially escalating and more deficit spending on the way for the U.S., do you feel that ownership of physical goods, real tangible assets, commodities, and precious metals, are those going to be something that are associated with survival as opposed to just financial protection? What are your thoughts there? Do you have any particularly favorite commodities?
Strange enough, any commodities. Now, the reason I like gold and silver is you can hold them in your hand. But the same thing would be true of corn. The same thing would be true of oil. In 1929, at the peak of the stock market peaked in 1929, and it took until 1954 to get back to the same level. I think mining was like 28 or 29% of the economy. In 1980, when silver and gold peaked, silver peaked at $50.25 and gold today at $8.75. Mining and resources were about 8 or 9% of the economy. Right now, they're 0.5%. We have a conflict. It's a conflict between the oligarchs and the debtors, and we're not sure how that's going to end up. But paper shuffling is now about 30% of the U.S. economy. And should the banks close, should the stock market crash, that's going to go down significantly, and commodities will be far more valuable. Paper commodities are about to assume their true value, and real commodities are about to assume their real value. So I'm very comfortable holding gold and silver, and I'm very comfortable holding resource stocks, even though they've been a total disaster for the last year or two.
Bob, as a final question for the person watching, who may be thinking about their children or their grandchildren and family and friends, what do you think you would tell people during these times, wherever they are, in terms of protecting themselves?
Strange enough, what they need to do is to realize they do need to protect themselves. The government's not going to protect you. The government's not your friend, okay? I would highly advise people to have 6 months to a year supply of food. You're going to eat the food anyway, okay? Mormons have done this for the last 150 years, and there was a short period of time when I was 5 or 6 years old where we were Mormons for about 3 months. And I went to a school, and you had school in the morning and you had Mormon church in the afternoon. But Mormons are a big believer in bad things happen, and you should keep a year's supply of food on hand. And they rotate the food, and that's just not a bad idea. Now, what's going to happen if we have a nuclear war? You can walk into Walmart or Costco or Safeway today and buy anything you want. We used to call the United States the Big PX when I was in Vietnam. And you can do that today. The day after somebody fires off the first nuke, every store in the United States, every store in the world is going to be cleaned out because people are going to realize they need to protect themselves. So having food, having fuel, having water, having cash, owning some physical gold and silver is just prudent. If I'm wrong, if McGregor is wrong, if the Secretary General of the UN is wrong, then it doesn't cost you anything to prepare. If we're right, it could save your life. In a nuclear war, 90% of the people who die are not going to die from radiation. They're not going to die from blast. They're going to starve to death.
Serious times, and thank you for the serious advice, Bob. It was a pleasure to speak with you today. And 321 Gold is your website, where you have wonderful interview and article commentary there. I visit that website daily, and our viewers should as well. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been good, and you asked good questions, and I would hope that we come out of this with some real leadership. A crisis is a wonderful time to change leadership from the incompetent to the competent. And I believe that we'll come through it. But we need some real leadership. And quite bluntly, we don't have it right now.